Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Mike Lasecki. Our topic today is Tell a Good Story, crafting mission statements and messages for your ATE project or center. I've turned on the recording, and I just wanted to remind you that you'll automatically get a link to this recording and the slides as well. Typically, it takes us 2 business days to process that recording. We'll send that out to all registered participants by email. It's my pleasure today to turn the webinar over to Rachael Bower. Rachael is the Director and PI at ATE Central. Welcome, Rachael. The webinar is yours.
Thanks so much, Mike. We're thrilled to be here again. We usually do a spring series of webinars at AT Central, and this year we're going to be focusing on issues related to branding and messaging, and we have a very special guest, Farra Trompeter from Big Duck, and she's going to tell you lots of good information about Big Duck, obviously, and then get right into the sort of meat and potatoes of our presentation today. But just before we do that, I just thought I'd run over very quickly a little bit of information about ATE and AT Central. So we're going to ask you in just a minute a little bit about yourselves, but just as a reminder, ATE is a funding stream from the National Science Foundation focusing on technician education and primarily based at community colleges. There are about somewhere between 300 and 350 projects and centers annually. At the moment, we have about 311. And it's not just a funding program, it's a real community. There's a lot of support sort of baked into the program, and a lot of cross-cutting support, projects and centers that work to ensure that folks get help with the issues that they need. Oops, there we go. And AT Central is one of those cross-cutting projects, and our goal is to really amplify the impact of ATE, to act as an information hub and a portal, provide an archive and a set of resources for folks that they can access. We also do, we create a lot of services and tools and focus a lot ourselves on helping people understand more about how they can do exemplary outreach and dissemination of their resources. And all of this comes from the community itself. We do a lot of work to understand the needs of the community, and one of the things that comes up all the time is that folks want to know more about issues related to how they broaden the impact of the work that their project and center is doing through outreach and dissemination pathways. And so as such, we are thrilled to have Farra with us today. I'm going to let her introduce herself, and we're going to get right into the bulk of the webinar. So Farra, go ahead and say hi and get right into it.
Hi everyone, Rachael, thanks for introducing me. As Rachael mentioned, I work for Big Duck. I'll tell you about that in a moment. I am Vice President here. For those of you who may be interested in connecting on Twitter, you can find me at Farra. I'm lucky enough to have both a unique name and be an early adopter. I am also often one of the people behind the Big Duck handle, so feel free to tweet with us if you like to play the Twitter game. If you want to learn more about me, you can check me out on our website, but briefly, I have been working with nonprofit organizations of all shapes and sizes in a variety of communications and fundraising roles for over 20 years. I've had the pleasure of being at Big Duck for almost 12 years, and Big Duck is a communications firm that works exclusively with nonprofit organizations. We're based here in Brooklyn, New York, and certainly you are welcome to come by and visit sometime, but we also love doing webinars and workshops with folks like ATE Central and also hosted here. So you can check out what we're up to on our website, and you'll be able to look at that afterwards through these slides as well. Big Duck, in essence, really focuses on helping organizations figure out how to use communications to achieve their mission. And we do that primarily by developing strong brands, strong campaigns, and strong teams, really making sure you have the basic assets to communicate who you are, provide opportunities for people to connect with you and take action in many different ways, and that you've got the right support on your team to make that happen. Today's conversation is really in our branding world as we talk about messaging, and we're going to touch briefly on branding as well. But we want to start with a quick poll. As Rachael mentioned, we'd love to find out who you are. So Rachael and Mike are going to set up the poll.
Absolutely. So we just want to learn a little bit about who you are, and you see that we have a few different options for you. Those are just buttons that you can click right on. Generally, we get a lot of folks who are affiliated with AT, but if you aren't, if you click that other button, we'd love to have you type into the chat window who you are, how you came to the webinar. Maybe you're an industry partner from ATE, or it sounds like, okay, there might be an echo. Somebody's getting an echo. You might be logged in twice. Shannon is saying if you're hearing an echo. So anyway, go ahead and let us know who you are in that that chat window. And it looks, not surprisingly, like most of our folks today, Farra, are affiliated with an ATE grant, but we do have a couple of people who are not currently funded, but they're writing a grant. And this is a great webinar to learn more about the portion of your grant that focuses on outreach and how you want to think about disseminating results. Oh, somebody who was a former NSF award recipient. Here we go. ATPI, but also growing our college and workforce success portfolio at a nonprofit. Great. Okay, Mike, I think you can close that now. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you all for taking that poll, and welcome again to today's conversation. What we're going to cover today is really just some brief basics as it relates to branding and messaging. Then we're going to talk about how clear and consistent messaging can really help your project or center. And again, while we've geared this to ATE projects or center, I think there are nuggets for everybody, regardless of where you are in that journey. And then giving you some tips on how to make sure your messaging takes hold once you develop it. So we've got a lot to cover in a little less than an hour, and we also will be making time for your questions as we go. Feel free to chat them in, and again, we will make time to answer those. So before we get started, we're going to ask you another question, and that's really trying to understand how you approach messaging and or outreach at the moment. So we're going to pull that poll back up, and this is just really if you had to pick one answer that best described it. You have not worked on anything formal as it relates to messaging or outreach. You've started working on it. You've done some work. You're actually masters, and you could be doing this webinar right along with us, which we welcome. There you go. Let us know. It looks like most people have actually done some work on this, which is great.
Yeah, that's great to see. And again, feel free if you want to stick something in if you want to click on the other button and put something in, we'd love to hear anything. Just give another second. Okay. Thanks, Mike, for pulling that poll up. Great. Great.
So I think our hope is that regardless of where you are on work you've done with messaging, you'll be able to find yourself in this process. And again, feel free to send specific questions in. So I want to start by asking you all yet another question. See, we're trying to engage you here, and I want to just have you chat in how you'd finish this sentence. How would you define branding? When you hear the word brand, what phrase comes to mind for you? How would you define it? Our brand is X. What phrase comes to mind for you? You told somebody you're on a webinar about branding. What would they think? How would you describe, well, what do you mean by branding? So we've got someone chatting in your image, your identity. Lots of folks saying identity, impressions, undefined. That may be how your particular brand is for sure. A clear description of what your organization stands for, recognition, right? Brand is a lot of these things. You know, hearing the first impression to the external world. I don't know if folks remember that Head and Shoulders commercial, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, right? Brand can be part of that. The value you deliver, your public voice. Great. So there's lots of great definitions here, you know, and it's funny that one of the last comments in here is about your voice, because that's one of the ways we've been thinking about the brand lately, that it really is kind of that your voice, your full representation of who you are, and that your brand is experienced across so many different channels, you know, and it's really important to think about how people see you, how they interact with you, what they hear about you, and really think about how your organization is represented. And all the things that you wrote, your image, your identity, what you're recognized for, all of that is part of branding. What I want to do here is really take apart an approach to branding that we developed at Big Duck over 10 years ago. We came up with this model based on really what we were seeing as a lot of fundamentals of branding models, but wanting to layer in a nonprofit lens to it all. And this model is really kind of defined in a book that we have a link to in the resources as well as in lots of webinars we've done on it. But we're going to do a quick overview for today's conversation just to get everyone on the same page. So a lot of us think about things like identity. It's funny, when I asked for answers, I didn't see anyone write logo, but I usually get that answer, right? Your logo, your name, that is part of your identity. But we really want to think about branding first geared in the organizational framework. Really, the foundation of your brand should be clarity around who you are, what your product or center is trying to do for the world, how you're getting that done, what really drives your work, who is really important to connect with you. And from all of that, we kind of distill what we would call the brand strategy, which is positioning and personality. I'm going to talk about what those things are, and we like to use positioning and personality to then lead us to either shape or refine what we look like and what we sound like at that identity level, and then ultimately how we're conducting outreach across communications channels. So those of you who've done branding work before, you may have heard terms like brand attributes, unique selling proposition, value proposition. These are all very similar, and we define them as positioning and personality just to give us sort of a common framework to think about all of this. So the first element is positioning. Positioning is, the way we define it in the brand raising model, is really kind of that single idea you want people to have in their minds about you. So not just that first impression, but almost that ongoing impression, that immediately thing. When I hear ATE Central, what comes to mind for me? What do I think of? Or when I think of your project or center, what immediately comes to mind? That's just kind of an initial thought. That's the position, kind of the essence of who you are. And it is really meant to be something simple. It's meant to be something, you don't necessarily publish it out in the world. It's just this kind of idea you've crystallized. And it's something that everyone on your team can remember, so that when they are getting ready to host an event or talk in front of a class or develop a postcard, whatever it may be, they are remembering that this big idea has to come through in everything that they do. And positioning is different than a mission statement. The mission statement, which we'll talk about in a moment, has a clear goal it has to do. It really must help explain your purpose and what you do. Whereas positioning, like I said, is really meant to be kind of that takeaway we want people to have of us. It may be similar to the mission statement ultimately, but it may also have language like, we are the best organization or project to do Y. And that boastful language may not be language we want to use publicly, but it is important for us to communicate through everything that we do. On the other hand, if positioning is the idea we have in folks' mind, personality is, I like to say, is the feeling in the heart, right? It's the sort of the tone and style your project or center uses. It's the feelings you want people to associate with you. Again, these are internal, and the point of them is to have us make decisions, so that if we were designing something, for example, or coming up with, let's say, a new descriptive phrase or tagline for our project or center, it's less about, I like this, I don't like that. It's more about, it feels more X or it feels less Y. So it is meant to be an objective tool to help us make decisions. It's also ideally distinguishing, that we're looking for words that not every single other project or center or similar organization could use in our space. We're looking for things, for example, we don't want to use credible and professional. Hopefully all organizations are that way. We're looking for things that are a little bit more distinguishing and unique. So I often use this example. This is not necessarily in the ATE world, but hopefully I've got some animal lovers out there. ASPCA and PETA, I don't know if you've heard of these organizations, but they definitely share a common approach. They're both trying to fight cruelty to animals, but the approach, the feelings we associate with them are very different, right? PETA might be seen as aggressive, militant, cutting edge, depending on how, where you see them, whereas ASPCA is warmer and more nurturing. And when you see campaigns by these organizations, you really can tell right away who's doing what. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is bring positioning and personality together to help us, as we think about our goals and our audiences and what we're trying to do, to help shape our brand strategy. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I think some questions have been coming in. I see some folks typing. I'm going to just pause for any questions at the moment.
We actually have one question that came to me. Somebody asked, in thinking about these things like personality positioning, who would be involved in thinking about that? Like, should it just be their direct staff, or should they be involving other people too, like maybe industry partners, as they start to, you know, start to think about those things? And you may get into that. Maybe a slightly premature question to ask at this point.
No, that's a good question. I don't think we have too much detail on that in this discussion. I think it's great to, you know, what we're really looking at is how do we want people to think and feel about us? It's sort of perception. And you certainly would want to start that conversation with the people who know you best, and that is likely your staff. It may also be some of your alumni or current students, some of the faculty in your programs, who really has the best sense of who you are and how you want to be seen. I often talk about, you know, think about who you are in your best day, and how do we really define that? Like, that's really the essence of who we are. That may not come across every experience, but I wish it did. Maybe there's one person who's just like the most amazing representative, and if you can get someone on the phone with them or in a room with them, you know they'll buy in. You know, what is it about that? How do we sort of crystallize that? And I think that can start with your internal team, but it's great to ask partners or ask, let's say students is a primary audience for some of you. You know, asking students who selected your program over another or didn't select your program, what do they think and feel about you, and was there a reason why they didn't do that, and just learning how you're perceived. So often that might be through interviews. You could certainly do a survey, give people a few statements or ideas to react to, but I find it best to do sort of probably a more qualitative, conversational-based research and bring people together. Another thing you could do is what we call a landscape scan. You could take a look at similar projects and centers either in your region or in other parts of the country that are similar to you, and try and take a guess at what you think they would want to be seen and felt as. Sometimes you see organizations using phrasing that really cues up what they want to be known or felt as in their About Us language, or in what they're putting out there, or in the approach to images they select, and try and get a sense of that, and then come back to you and see where you fit in, or if it triggers any new ideas for how you might be different, or what you also want to accentuate.
That's great. That's really good information, Farra. I also noticed that somebody put a question in the chat that says, I've heard the term brand audit, but I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Sure, that's a great question, Ruth. It really, a lot of people define a brand audit in different ways. I would say at the simplest, and what we can do, I'll make a note of this. I'll see if I have a good article to send out, and when we send out the slides, maybe we can send some additional resources. I'll see if I can find something that's helpful on this topic. But a brand audit, in essence, is an inventory. It's sort of taking a look at how you've been communicating, really looking, pulling up. We like to look at the past 2 or 3 years of communication. So that's materials you've sent out, newsletters, reports, postcards, flyers, mailings, emails, social media posts, anything that you've put out there, and really looking at it. Literally sometimes printing it all out and looking at it on a table, looking for, someone suggested consistency earlier, I think Karen, are you communicating in a way visually and with messaging that's consistent? Or are you communicating in a way that if somebody was to really take a step back and look at it, it would feel all over the place? That's the most obvious thing you would see, but it could also be drilling deeper, really looking at what you've produced and seeing if there is, what we often find with organizations and projects and centers is that they might be communicating one way to one particular audience and another, a very different way to another. And yes, what a big funder might want to expect from you versus student, and the language and the tone you have to use may be different, but we don't want to come across as completely different animals in that exchange. We want to have some similarities, some essences of who we are. So an audit is really just kind of looking at everything you've been producing from the perspective of, what is the messages we're putting out there, what is the feelings and the ideas, and are they the right ones? Are they the ones we want, or are we doing it great over here and we could be better over there? But again, I'll take a look and see if there's a good article about that we can share as a follow-up.
That sounds great. I think that's it for the moment.
Great. All right. Well, feel free to keep sending questions in as we go, and we'll take another break in a few moments. So the next, and we're going to queue up a poll in a moment, so get those voting fingers ready. We want to talk now about really, the whole idea of this webinar was about storytelling and telling a good story. So really, what can telling a good story do for your project or center? Just want you to think about that as we go into the next section. So we've got a poll here just saying, what do you really hope to get out of having better messaging for your project or center? So I'm going to launch that poll. I'd love to see you vote.
Right. Yeah. And again, as always, you're welcome to put, if you click on other, if there's something other you'd really like to let us know about that you're hoping messaging can help with, feel free to put whatever that information is in the chat window. Oh, so Ruth just said promote the use of our resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. It's interesting. Really, our highest one is that clarification of kind of who
we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really, and again, I'll include maybe some more about the brand raising and brand strategy. That would be helpful for folks to read more about.
A couple of people are typing in others. Okay. Let's see. Choose others. I feel, oh, Janice is saying she thinks all of them are essential for effective message. Change perception. Okay, that's interesting. All right.
Great.
There we go.
Yeah, so we had a shift or change perceptions in there too as well.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got most of you looking to clarify, but we saw a few other folks, including something around collaboration, which is great, and resource sharing. So we are going to dive into a messaging platform. So I wanted to share really what we think of, how we define a messaging platform. And for us with messaging, we're thinking about, the written and spoken aspects of your brand. So kind of what you sound like. If the visual side is what you look like, this is what you sound like. So some branding firms talk about having a verbal identity. That's what we're talking about here. So this is typically some of the primary elements are vision and mission statements, as well as then breaking down messaging with key messages, boilerplate, and elevator pitch. So what we're going to do is take apart each of these, show some examples, and then again, we'll pause and see what questions you have for us, but feel free to chat them in. So the first is a vision statement. A vision statement typically says this is kind of our big hopes for the world, the dream we have, that if we could have our way, this is what the world would look like. Mission statements tend to be sort of our answer to that. So if the vision statement is this sort of idealistic future, the mission is how we are going to get there, how our project or center is going to deliver upon that vision. So I often use as an example, the Canadian Cancer Society has a vision where no Canadian fears a cancer diagnosis, right? That's a vision we can all get around, whether or not we live in Canada. So their mission of how they do that through research and treatment helps support that. And I think though we are talking about projects and centers, having a vision can be really motivating. It can draw people in. And I'll be curious if any of you have done work around that. You can certainly chat that in if you have. So the mission statement really is probably where most of you will want to spend your time, which is really explaining what you do. Short and simple, what is it that you do? What is your purpose? What is your approach? ATE's got a lot of great resources on mission statements, and I know I found this one, this set of questions as you're thinking about your mission statement. Some questions you might ask yourself that can help you as you're drafting your mission statement are noted here. And I'll pause and see if Rachel wants to chime anything in on this slide.
Absolutely. I mean, I think these all come from our outreach kit, which is online and is another free resource that you can find. But I do think that for a lot of the AT community, when I've talked about the issues related to audience, that most people have a couple of specific audiences that they focus on that are in their grant, but they don't necessarily sort of think about this wrapping a mission statement around that. So I think it's good to think about all your audiences and to think about a mission statement. And I'd gotten a specific question too in chat. where someone was sort of saying, like, all we do is build curriculum. Do we really need to think about things like a mission statement or a brand strategy? So maybe, Farra, at some point as you go along, we can talk a little bit about, even for a small project, why some of these things might be helpful. And one of the things that I would say is that for many folks who have an initial grant, they may want to be going back to NSF and doing a bigger project, or even thinking about becoming a center. So understanding some of these sort of larger outreach goals, thinking about things like a mission statement, can really help you as you move into promoting even just the curriculum you're developing, or thinking about becoming larger or growing your project or center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I saw what Katie's chatted in. You know, the mission statement for that center might be why. You know, I would say actually, again, in the technical terms, I like to think about the vision statement as the why and the mission statement as the what. But again, I think as you're adapting this to where you are and what your organization is, you can kind of play with both and see what makes the most sense. So we're going to talk about, you know, when you work on these vision and mission statements, or if your organization or your product or center might have a purpose statement or just a very simple line that explains what you do, whether it's labeled vision, mission, or else, you really want to make sure that you're being as simple as possible, that you are avoiding jargon, remembering that while there are people who may not be well versed in technical education, and they may not, when you're really trying to present these statements, you want to be as simple as you can be. This is where having people who are not in your world, you know, your spouses, your significant others, the UPS delivery person, whoever it may be, have them read it and see if they understand it. That can be a good test to do. You know, you want to make sure they are explaining who you are, but in a way that is clear and compelling, and also maybe what sets you apart. This is where you can apply that positioning and personality, see how they are reflecting that, and then likely you'll need to explain and connect your project or center to the organization you're affiliated with. I wanted to share an example of an organization we've done some work with. This is not an ATE project or center, but it's in the world of education, so I hope that is close enough. Educators Rising is an initiative that is tied to its own organization, tied to a group called PDK International, and they used to be called Future Educators of America, and we worked with them on a whole process where we renamed them to Educators Rising. We did new visuals, which you'll see kind of in there, and we did messaging. So their big vision was, we want to see, you know, an America where every teacher has the skills and experience they need to help all students achieve their potential, right? A big statement for them, and then their mission of how they're doing that is really by helping young people become teachers. They work primarily in high schools and try and then, and beyond that, to try and cultivate new teachers. So that's kind of sort of answering that together. And an example here for a mission statement, this is an ATE program. I'll let you all read this, but you can see how this is explaining. This is a little bit longer. It's explaining what the purpose of the project is, who it's working with, and that it has some detailed outcomes it's seeking to do, strengthening STEM, while also really looking at some broader elements related to environmental science by Native Americans. So this is just another way to approach this. These are all different things. And one thing I hope you'll do after this call is that if you do have a mission statement, again, sort of read it with new eyes and see if anything comes up for you. So that's a little bit about vision and mission. I want to talk about key messages, boilerplate, and elevator pitch, and then we'll pause for questions. So we like to think about key messages as really kind of the building blocks of how we would tell the story about your organization. So I often say, you know, if you can imagine there was a book about your project or center, and it was on the table, and I opened it up, and I was looking at the table of contents, what would jump out to me as those chapter headings? What would be the essence, the 3 to 5 things I really need to know this book is about, right? And that's hopefully what a good table of contents does for us when we're looking at a book. Similarly, key messages are really meant to be kind of the immediate messages or points we want to understand as we're looking at materials. And as we develop these key messages, we can use them to then start creating other content, whether that is speeches, website content, newsletters, etc. Key messages are really an internal tool we then use to build external tools from. So in the case of Educators Rising, here's an example. Their key messages were crafted initially for who they were working through to reach young people, administrators, teachers, and funders. Then they had a separate set for young people themselves. When they were talking to key messages or they were writing to these audiences, to these adults, they always framed it in the problem, solution, and kind of implications. So here's the problem that's happening and why our organization is needed. In this case, here's what we do, and here's what it means. And again, this key message document they have has lots of sub-bullets under each of these. And if they're talking to a room full of teachers who understand what the problem is, they might just go right to solution and go from there and explain what they do, but they've got a place to jump off of. When they talk to young people, really they're talking to them surrounding these two big ideas, that this is a great profession to go into, and that this organization is really helpful and supportive for you. So all of that then comes together to boilerplate and elevator pitch. The boilerplate is really kind of the written explanation of who you are and takes all those key messages into a place. And you can see the boilerplate for Educators Rising here. So it sort of starts by telling a little bit of a story about kind of, again, the need for this organization, a little bit of the problem, and then getting into how they're the solution and then how you can take action and get involved by going to their website and landing on that in the third paragraph. And this is language they use on the About Us page, on the back of a brochure, bottom of a press release, etc. This is meant to be used verbatim. And then the elevator pitch is really kind of here 2 sentences their staff have hopefully memorized and they're using to introduce the organization. After they say this elevator pitch and make the introduction, they certainly will then get into different elements of what they do based on who they're talking to. But again, an elevator pitch is meant to be written in a way that's very conversational, sounds like something somebody might say, and hopefully short enough that people can actually remember it, and maybe if they put their own spin on it, as long as it has those kind of ideas there, that's okay. So I'm going to pause. If anyone has done any of this work, certainly feel free to share any lessons you've learned that you want to make sure others hear about, or any questions you have for us. So I'm just going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
There, I did get a question. Oh, we got
Sure.
Mike saying, in your opinion, can a blog by itself be a messaging platform?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I think this is where the word platform maybe is confusing. So the blog is definitely a platform to get information out about us, and it is definitely a place where we would get messages out about our organization. But when I say messaging platform, what I mean there is really just kind of the core elements of who you are, and you might, again, in the case of Educators Rising, if their key messages were around problem, solution, action, they might use that to drive the content strategy of their blog. They might say, well, once a month, let's make sure we blog about the problem. 3 times a month, let's talk about the solution. And, most of the time, let's talk about how people can get involved and where they can play a role in all of this work. So I think there could be a relationship between the blog and the messaging platform, but in the way I intend to use it here, it's different tools.
Somebody else asked me, in terms of the messaging, who should be able to articulate what the project or center does? Should it just be the staff, or at a certain point, should you be trying to get sort of other people to be, other stakeholders involved, or other people to be able to sort of act as evangelists for you?
So I'm going to shortly say, ideally the latter, that there are more than just the staff who understand it, but we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. So let me hold that,
Okay.
and we can talk a little bit more about that in a few moments.
Okay. I think we can keep going then.
All right, great. So let's assume you've done some of this work, you've done some thinking about what are the ideas we want to come through and how we communicate, how do we write about ourselves, how do we talk about ourselves, how do we explain our why and our what. Then we really get into producing things. So as we're crafting messaging and as we're crafting our communications, it's really important to think about audience, who is it that we want to tell our story, and then to start creating these messages and get them out there. So when we talk about audiences, some of the things we want you to think about is really, first and foremost, who's already connected to your mission, to your project, to your center, to what you do? Who already knows you? I think sometimes when we think about audiences, we right away go to the people who don't know us but should. That there are people who we go right away to the new audiences. But it's important to make sure that people who already know us for the right reasons. And as we're thinking about our audiences, whether they are new friends or old friends, it's important to see the world through their eyes and to really try and imagine what do they need to see and hear, where do they need to see and hear it, to make sure that what we're doing is really connecting with them. And then when we are creating outreach materials, we want to make sure we're not overwhelming that audience. So if any of you do a materials review or a brand audit, it'd be great if you could kind of look at your materials, because if your newsletter has 20 different links of things to do, or your postcard has 3 different things that someone could take action on, that might be overwhelming and actually result in people doing nothing. We generally recommend less is more. You know, drive people, whether that's to a URL, a Facebook page, a phone number, whatever it may be, to really try and focus in. So when we think about audiences, it can also be helpful to drill down. So instead of saying potential students, maybe saying female students interested in robotics, right? So try and, you know, think a little bit specifically about who you're trying to reach. And we don't have time in today's conversation to go deeply into it, but we have created a worksheet for you, as Mike mentioned, that's on the right panel under Files. You can download this Word document. It's 2 pages. It's pretty straightforward. And take a stab at doing this. You really try and think about who these audiences are. Give that persona a name. So if we're trying to do female students interested in robotics, maybe we call her Farra. You know, you can lend myself to this exercise. And as you're doing that, really write down who, you know, use that one person to represent the group. What do you know about them? How old are they? Where do they live? What do they care about? What's on their minds? What do they think of your organization? What's getting in the way of them getting involved? What's really important for them to understand and do as they interact with you? So that's what we hope will be a helpful worksheet to you. Encourage you to do it and see what comes up for you as you do that. So before we launch into the next section, I believe this might be our last poll. And we'd love to know how this gets to the question Rachel started asking, which is, let's look at your staff themselves. How well does everyone on your project do in explaining who you are?
All right, so let us know here. I'm not surprised that that middle one is already taking kind of a strong lead, because I think most of us feel like, you know, they're probably not a big duck, but in many of our organizations, you know, I think there's always a percentage of people who kind of have it down, and then there's some folks who would struggle a little bit more if you put them in the spotlight and ask them to describe things.
Yeah, I think we often find with most organizations or projects or centers that the people who work in outreach, the people who are, you know, maybe showing up at an exhibit fair, they can do a great job, but the person who maybe answers the phone or answers most of the emails or who's doing the programmatic work themselves, they can explain what they do, but they can't really explain the big picture. That is very common.
Okay, I think that's good. Thanks, Mike.
All right, so some of the things we'd love you to think about as you are really trying to develop your messages are here. You know, first and foremost, these are questions that we hope you would ask and maybe would trigger some ideas for your messaging and how you tell your story. You know, what is your organization? What's your project or center? What do you do and why? Again, that's the what and the why. Who is your audience? What programs, who are you reaching as you do your programs? Who do you work with? Who funds you? Who hosts your project? And what's that host institution? Where are you based? What are some results or outcomes you've generated? What are you looking for the future? That answering these questions might just lead into another way to explain who you are and tell your story. That may be a better place to start for some of you. We just want to offer kind of multiple routes to get at these things. And as you're asking, you know, I want to just pause for a second. For those of you who do have some messaging, are there any other questions you can imagine adding to this list that would be helpful for folks to ask and answer for themselves in describing their work? Just see if anybody wants to chat in any additional questions that they think messaging is important to have around. I'll give it a minute, see if anyone has any other ideas. Got a few people typing, so that's good. Who are your most important partners, right? Where does your funding come from, right? So really breaking down that funding and partners question. It sounds like that's a really important element. You know, and the successes you've had, I wonder if talking about key alumni or professors who've worked with you, getting into that and what they're doing now, you know, 5, 10 years later, if you keep in touch with folks. Got 1 or 2 more questions coming in, and then we'll go to the next slide. Don't forget your volunteer workforce, right? Talking about your volunteers and who you work with, that's a great point. And how does your work align with your host institutions, right? What's the mission of your host institution, and how does your project or center fit within that? That's a great one. So as you develop these messages, what's going to be really important, as we said, is to hopefully have as many people on your team, and maybe even beyond your team, be able to represent you consistently and clearly. So the first thing we really hope you would do is create a training. Even if you have messaging that's existed and you don't change your messages after today's webinar, that's okay. But actually put it all together in one place. And, you know, maybe at an upcoming staff meeting or in a special meeting, gather everybody around and make sure they know that you have that resource. Train them, explain why it's important to understand these messages and use them. And really that why goes all the way back to your goal, which for most of you might be recruitment, it might be funding, it might just be participation and increasing that. So remembering that all of this is in service of what you're trying to do overall with your project or center, and we want to use messaging and other communications tools to support that. So let people know both why this is important and what your messages are. Then possibly, you know, when we talk about creating it in a brand-aligned format, that idea is really whether that is in a one-page document, a poster, a flyer, something that really looks and feels like your project or center, something that people feel proud to look at, not just a typical Word document. Have it be something that maybe is designed and put up at people's desks. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Make sure that everyone has reference and access to it. I often find organizations have messaging, but it's stuck on one person's computer. Whether that's Drive or an intranet or any tool that you're using, make sure that people have access to it and know where they can get it. It can be great to, if you do a training, to record it for people who miss it, or require it as part of onboarding. As you bring in new staff, have them listen to it, or make sure you repeat that training at least twice a year. And then again, maybe you actually want to make signage that goes up around your space and around your office or other elements as the more public-facing aspects of your messaging. So as an example of that, we worked with Educators Rising, and this is up in their office. You can see on the left what somebody's desk typically looks like, and then we've got a zoom in of the poster that's on the wall. And what we see here are 2 of the messaging elements. First is the brand personality, right, where it is about they really want people to think that they are energized, expert, fresh, charismatic, and powerful. And you can see their visual brands and the tagline we developed for them here, right? There's power in teaching, right? There's an energy as all of that comes together. And then the elevator pitch, which we shared earlier, is right there. So that if someone's on the phone doing a webinar, whatever it may be, they're reading that elevator pitch and representing the organization at that highest level in a consistent way. So that is really, we've got some resources for you which I want to be able to share and walk through. I want to just pause, see if there are any questions, then I'll go through those resources and we'll see if there are any more questions here. This is what I hope is a great opportunity for you to both ask questions of me or maybe even each other, share any resources you want to make sure folks have on this topic on how we tell our story and use messaging. As folks are chatting in their questions or comments or ideas, I know we did get a question about message testing. You know, messaging testing, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. There is certainly the fast and cheap and the long and expensive routes. The fast and cheap way to do, you know, messaging testing would be if you had 2 or 3, let's say 2 or 3 taglines or 2 or 3 messaging ideas, having folks that you have access to in your database over email, whatever it may be, respond to them, give you feedback about them, maybe via survey or through a focus group. Ask them sort of specific, which of these best does X, which of these best does Y, which feels the most X if you've done personality, giving people things to respond to. You can certainly do that. There's also more formal messaging testing you can do where you actually work with an external market research firm. They recruit people for you. They go to random people who maybe fill out similar demographics but may not know your organization and go much deeper in that. Some organizations do hire for that. They then do iterative messaging work over time as people respond to different statements and aspects of the messaging. What most organizations I've worked with tend to do is really kind of iterative messaging. So they create this messaging, they use it for a few months, they check in, they find out what's been working, what hasn't been working as they've been talking to people or using it in copy. You know, what's getting more clicks or more opens, what's raising more eyebrows and getting people to want to learn more, what's turning people off, then debrief and discuss and refine it. So there's so many different ways you can do messaging testing. It's really often comes down to budget and capacity. So I don't know who asked that messaging testing question, but if there was more you were hoping for there, definitely chat that in.
We have another question that just came up in chat. You can probably see this, Farra, that Stuart is asking about the newest technologies that seem to facilitate these various goals: social media choices, media, video, podcasts, 360 VR, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think about, I got my first email address in college, and I feel like I was in the right place at the right time to start, you know, really bracing new technology back then. And it has only, you know, every year there's a new communications channel to think about. If we did this webinar 2 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about virtual reality. Or maybe now we might be talking about chat bots. You know, if you're in Facebook Messenger and they're chatting with you, I mean, every year, if not every day, there's a new app, there's a new way to communicate, which is great and exciting, but certainly overwhelming. I would first answer that question to say it's really important with all these new opportunities and approaches, and we're going to talk more about this in our next webinar on February 28th? That may not be, that's today's date. Well, Rachel or Mike will chat on the exact date of the next webinar. But in the one in late February, we're going to get into strategies and tactics, and we'll talk about these things a little bit more then. But briefly, I would always say let your audience guide your decision. So where are the people that you are trying to reach and engage? Where are they spending their time? It's the next webinar is February 26th. Where are the people you're trying to reach spending their time? What are the best channels to communicate your message to bring into our conversation? And then what do you really have resources for? Some of these communications channels come with different costs, whether that is a financial cost or a people, time, resource cost. You know, things like video and 360 VR are awesome. Someone can do a tour of your campus or see a classroom in action. That's great to do, but that can, again, be expensive to produce or to produce it well. But I think the more you can bring your project or center to life, whether that's in an everyday way as you're posting things on Instagram, whether that is in how you are telling your story through video or audio. I mean, I think there's so many different things you can do. It really just comes down to what do you have the resources for and what makes sense given your audiences. So, you know, again, I would encourage you to do the audience profile worksheet, come back and join us on the February 26th webinar, and we'll talk more about that a bit then as well. But thank you, Stuart. That's a good question to think about.
Yeah, it was interesting. At one point, AT Central did a survey to try to find out what ATE project and center audiences were using in terms of social media. And one of the big differences between ATE and the rest of the world is how much more ATE audiences and ATE in general use LinkedIn than things like, you know, even though Facebook was still high, LinkedIn was one of the highest social media platforms used in this community and by this community's audiences. So, you know, that helped a lot of people think about, oh, if I'm not on LinkedIn, this might be an important place for me to go. But it could vary too. You know, I think just because that's what we found across AT doesn't mean your specific audience is using LinkedIn a lot. But finding that specific info out looks, let's see, might be interesting looking at an ebook one of our AT projects developed called 5 Steps for Using Social Media to Build Your Brand and Promote Your Business. There you go.
Great.
And Carol's typing in something too. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. LinkedIn is an interesting. A lot of us forget about LinkedIn when we're thinking about social networks and we're talking about them. We're talking about Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat, maybe even. And LinkedIn is really one of the oldest ones at this point. LinkedIn was started before Facebook, and has been around for. It's the professional network. It's, a network we often go to if we're looking for work or we're looking for candidates to work for us. It's a really important channel. And again, this is where it comes down to your audiences. If people are coming to your ATE product or center to advance their career, then they might be looking at LinkedIn, right? Because that is what their goal and their mindset is. And so that's the shift I would hope you would make in this conversation and the one we have next, is that you're making these decisions based on what what makes sense given the people you're trying to engage. Well, I want to, in our last few minutes, just share some other resources we have put together for you. We'll also have been taking notes of things that we want to share afterwards, so we'll get that over to you. But again, feel free to chat in any questions or other resources that you know of that could be helpful for this community. As I mentioned before, we are going to be doing a webinar on February 26th at the same time, same bat channel on Adobe Connect, about really using strategies to guide your tactics. So we'll be picking up from this conversation and getting a little bit more nitty-gritty into that. We mentioned the ATE Central before and the Outreach Kit. Maybe, Rachel, you want to say a little bit about what's there?
Absolutely. So this is something that we actually created a while back with WGBH in Boston, and we looked at a whole bunch of different areas of outreach, trying to help folks think just about things like vision and mission, but also use of social media, how to deal with press, all kinds of things, and all of it's free to use. You're welcome to go online and work your way through it, and we're always here to give you support and help if you start digging into it and you feel like you have questions. You can always get in touch with us at info@atcentral.net.
I mentioned earlier we wrote a book. Our CEO and founder, Sarah Durham, wrote this book a little over 10 years ago, really all about how do you connect your brand to goals like raising funds, increasing your visibility. You can pick up that book, at least on Amazon, if not in other bookstores. And it is, a good primer on these topics if you're looking to go a little bit deeper. We've also got a webinar about this on our website, which we'll send out a link to with the follow-up. We recently started podcasting, to Stuart's mention of podcasts a few minutes ago. We've got a podcast we've been doing since May called the Smart Communications Podcast. You can download and listen to episodes on our website at just bigducknyc.com/podcasts. They are also in iTunes and Google Play. They're about 10 minutes long. I think we release an episode every 2 weeks, pretty bite-sized. Really interesting topics on all different aspects of communications, branding, fundraising, etc. And I'm getting an error message on this image, but this was really, I believe, our slide to say thank you. So I want to just pause. I'll go back to this and see if there are any other. It looks like there's some more. Janice is sharing some other resources here, and again, I think we can try and capture these resources in the chat with our follow-up.
Absolutely. Slate has a lot of great resources. And I think maybe, Mike, we should go ahead and open up our, quickly open up our survey at the end. As for many of you familiar, at the end of a webinar like this, we like to just gather a little bit of feedback for us about your experience with the webinar. So we're going to open that. It should open in a new window for you. And of course, we'd love to get your feedback through the survey, and feel free to email either of us if you have questions. As Farra said, we have another webinar coming up. We hope you'll join us for that and let other folks know about it too. And we will be sending out an email that gives you a link to this webinar, which again, you're welcome to share or listen to again. And I'd really like to thank Farra. This is really great. It was a great follow-up. Farra did a workshop at the PI conference, and this has been a great follow-up to that work too.
Always my pleasure.
Rachel, thank you for breaking in, Rachel. I'm just about ready to open the survey. Most of you know that it will open in another window. this webinar window will remain open. So once you've done the survey, just close it and come back in and close out. Rachel and Farra, that officially ends our webinar today. I'm going to launch the survey now, stop the recording, and we certainly look forward to hearing from both of you again
Thanks,
in
everybody.
February. So thank you.
All right, so please just take the survey. It's a really brief one, but it's super helpful for us to collect information and get feedback from you guys. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.